coach pointed at the old man's limp and laughed, said it looked like he was dancing on a broken spring. The team laughed. Two teenagers, still learning how cruelty feels when you're not the target. The grandfather didn't flinch. He just stood there in his light blue button-down, silver goatee, catching the afternoon sun, a small golden navy pin on his chest. The coach saw it a second too late. That pin meant he'd just mocked a combat wound in front of 20 kids. And the old man's grandson was watching from the sideline. His name is Arthur Tutor. Shrapnel near Fallujah left him with that limp. He never talks about it, but the pin on his chest, Vietnam Veterans of America, tells the story he won't. Now his grandson's team has a coach who crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. This isn't one bad joke. It's a pattern. Youth sports coaches who humiliate, intimidate, and face no consequences. Arthur could have walked away. Instead, he chose to do something that would shake the whole league to its foundation. Here's how one quiet grandfather took on a system that was never designed to protect people like him. Arthur was 62 when he walked onto that soccer field. He'd spent 20 years in the army, 2 of them at a small firebase outside Fallujah. He earned a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a shrapnel scar that ran from his knee to his hip. The limp was permanent. He never complained about it. He never used it as an excuse. He just lived with it the way some men live with a stiff shoulder or a bad knee. His grandson Ethan was 12 years old, small for his age, but fast. Fast enough to start as left wing on the Springfield Strikers, a travel team coached by Dave Coleman. Coach Coleman had been coaching for 16 years. His teams won 3 state titles. He was known for discipline, for pushing kids hard, and for a temper that parents described as intense but necessary. The league board had received 8 informal complaints about his methods over the past 4 seasons. Every single one was dismissed as part of a winning culture. But here is what the complaints actually said. A parent claimed Coleman called a player a waste of cleats. Another said he screamed at a 14-year-old until the boy threw up behind the bleachers. The most recent was from a mother whose daughter transferred teams after Coleman said she played like she was afraid of the ball. The board chairman, a retired insurance salesman named Donald Hayes, told each complainant that Coach Coleman was a valuable asset and that youth sports required thick skin. Arthur knew none of this when he arrived at the practice field that Tuesday evening in late September. The air had that first bite of autumn. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the grass. Ethan had been nervous all day. His grandfather being at practice was unusual, and 12-year-olds feel the weight of that kind of attention. Arthur sat on a metal bleacher near the sideline, wearing a light blue button-down shirt and creased khakis. The veteran's pin on his left breast was small, gold and navy, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. The practice started normally, warm-up laps, passing drills, then a scrimmage. Ethan made a mistake. He misjudged a through ball, turned the wrong way, and the opposing striker scored. Coach Coleman blew his whistle so hard the sound cut through the whole field. He walked toward Ethan, stopped 2 feet from him, and pointed. That was when he noticed the man on the sideline, specifically the way the man was standing. Arthur had shifted his weight onto his good leg, a subtle lean most people wouldn't notice. But Coleman noticed, and instead of saying nothing, instead of correcting the play, he imitated the stance. He pretended to limp across the field. He said loudly, loud enough for every parent and player to hear, that what your grandpa taught you, how to dance on one leg. Some kids laughed, not all. Some looked at Ethan, who had gone pale. Arthur did not move. He did not shout. He simply stood there, one hand in his pocket, looking directly at the coach. And then Coach Coleman's eyes dropped to the shirt, to the small golden navy pin, and his face changed. He recognized it. Vietnam Veterans of America. He knew exactly what that meant. The color drained from his cheeks the way it does when a person realizes they have just done something irreversible. Coleman walked toward Arthur. He was probably going to apologize, but Arthur held up one hand, palm out, the same hand that had once signaled ceasefires in a language older than English. He said nothing. He turned, walked to his old Ford pickup, and drove home. That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table and cried, not because of the play, not because of the coach, because he had seen his grandfather humiliated in front of everyone he cared about. And Ethan was old enough to know that some apologies cannot undo what has already been done. Arthur called the league president the next morning. Donald Hayes listened politely, then explained that Coach Coleman had already called him, that it had all been a misunderstanding, that the coach was sorry and would issue a personal apology. Hayes used the word unfortunate 3 times in 5 minutes. Arthur asked what consequence the coach would face. There was a long silence. Hayes said the league would have a conversation, an internal one, and that the board took all complaints seriously. Arthur asked if that meant suspension. Hayes said he could not comment on potential disciplinary actions. Arthur hung up and opened his laptop. He searched for coaching misconduct claims, youth sports, emotional abuse, systematic patterns. He found a study that said 63% of coaches who abuse do so to multiple victims. He found a legal brief about how veterans are a protected class under federal law. He found a U.S. Center for Safe Sport document that said coaches are responsible for modeling respect and inclusion. He printed those pages and laid them out on his dining room table. Then he called an attorney, not a family lawyer, a disability rights attorney named Sandra Okonkwo, who had represented a veteran in a similar case 3 years ago and won a settlement that made national news. Sandra listened to the whole story without interrupting. When Arthur finished, she said 2 words: "We file." The document landed at the league office by certified mail on a Friday afternoon. It cited the Americans with Disabilities Act, USCRRA, and the league's own code of conduct, which explicitly prohibited public humiliation of any participant or spectator. Arthur asked for a formal hearing, a public apology, and the immediate suspension of Coach Coleman pending investigation. On Monday, Arthur's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The text read, "This isn't going to end well for you." He did not reply. He forwarded it to Sandra. 2 days later, a letter arrived from an attorney representing Coach Coleman, threatening a defamation lawsuit if Arthur did not retract his complaint. Arthur read the letter twice. Then he walked to his garage, opened a brown cardboard box labeled Fallujah, and pulled out a manila envelope that contained something Coach Coleman had no idea existed, something that would change everything. The manila envelope was not thick. It held 42 pages, mostly medical records and military citations, but the real weight was in a single piece of paper, a commendation from the Secretary of the Army dated April 15, 2004. It detailed how then-Staff Sergeant Arthur Jenkins, after sustaining shrapnel wounds to his right leg, continued to direct his squad through a 30-hour engagement. The document noted that he refused evacuation until all his men were secure. That injury, the one he still carried, was the same limp Coach Coleman had mocked. Arthur had never shown these papers to anyone outside his family. Not even his son knew the full citation existed. But on that Monday morning, he scanned every page and emailed them to Sandra Okonkwo. She read them, then called him and asked permission to include the citation in the legal filing. Arthur paused for 7 seconds. Then he said, "Do what you have to do." The amended complaint was served at noon that same day. It included a request for emotional distress damages, citing not only the public humiliation, but the re-traumatization of a combat veteran whose service-connected disability was weaponized against him. Sandra added a line that would become the centerpiece of the case. The defendant did not merely mock a limp. He mocked a signature wound of the global war on terror in front of 23 witnesses. Coach Coleman's attorney, a man named Richard Voss, who specialized in defending schools and sports leagues, filed a motion to dismiss within 48 hours. The motion argued that Coleman's comment was protected speech, that it occurred during a sporting event where robust commentary was expected, and that Arthur's presence as a spectator on public bleachers did not constitute protected activity under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Voss used the phrase "trivial playground" banter 3 times. Sandra responded by filing a motion for temporary restraining order, demanding Coach Coleman be removed from all coaching duties pending the outcome of the case. She included affidavits from 2 parents who had witnessed the incident. One wrote, "I saw my 11-year-old daughter laugh because she was scared not to." The other wrote, "Coach Coleman has done things like this before. He called my son weak for crying after a collision." The judge assigned to the case was the Honorable Lisa Tran, a former civil rights attorney appointed to the bench in 2018. She had a reputation for reading every filing carefully and for not tolerating procedural games. On the 3rd day after the TRO filing, she issued a 1-paragraph order. It read, "The court finds sufficient evidence of potential harm to grant the temporary restraining order." Defendant David Coleman is hereby prohibited from any contact with minor athletes pending further hearing. The hearing is set for October 10th. The reaction was immediate. The league board held an emergency meeting that evening. Donald Hayes, the league president who had told Arthur it was all a misunderstanding, now found himself in a room with 7 other board members, most of whom had never read their own code of conduct. The code was 12 pages long. Section 5, paragraph 2 read, "No coach shall ridicule, humiliate, or demean any player, official, or spectator on the basis of any physical characteristic or disability." The penalty for violation included immediate suspension pending board review. The board had never enforced that section. When one member brought it up, Donald Hayes said, "We need to see how the court case goes before we do anything." Another member asked, "What if we suspend him and he gets cleared? We will look like we threw him under the bus." The board voted 7-1 to await the court outcome before taking any internal action. That same night, Ethan told his mother he wanted to quit soccer. He said, "I do not want to go back to that field." His mother asked if he was afraid of the coach. Ethan said, "No, I am afraid the other kids will see my grandpa's papers on the news and make fun of him. I am afraid I made this happen by being bad at soccer." Arthur overheard this from the hallway. He waited until Ethan went to bed, then he drove to the Maple Diner, ordered coffee, and sat alone for 2 hours. At 11:30, he called Sandra. He said, "I want to tell the whole story, not just the court filing. I want to go public." Sandra asked if he was ready for the attention. Arthur said, "I have been invisible my whole life. It is time to be seen." The local news station, a Springfield affiliate, ran the first segment 3 days later. The reporter, a young woman named Keisha Thomas, had been covering local government and sports for 4 years. She had never covered a story like this. The segment was 3 minutes long. It showed Arthur walking across the bleachers, his limp visible under the stadium lights. It showed the legal filing, redacted for privacy. It ended with Keisha saying, "The question now is whether a coach who has won 3 state titles will be held responsible for what he said to one grandfather." That segment went viral regionally. Within 24 hours, the station website logged 42,000 views. The comments were split almost exactly in half. One commenter wrote, "He is a hero. Respect the pin." Another wrote, "It was a joke. Get over it." A third wrote, "Ethan should not have been playing soccer if he could not handle feedback." Arthur read all the comments. He did not respond to any of them. Then came the pivot, the moment that reframed everything. A former player from Coach Coleman's team, now a college freshman, reached out to Keisha Thomas through a private message. His name was Marcus. He said he had been a goalie for the Strikers 4 years earlier, when he was 13. He said Coach Coleman had done something worse than mock a Limp. He said the coach had grabbed him by the jersey during a practice, lifted him off the ground, and screamed in his face about a missed save. Marcus said he had never told anyone. He said he was still in therapy. Keisha called Sandra. Sandra called Arthur. Arthur sat at his dining room table and added Marcus's name to his spiral notebook alongside the dates of the unannounced visits and the threatening voicemails from the earlier family dispute. The patterns were aligning. Sandra filed a motion to add Marcus as a witness. Coach Coleman's attorney objected, calling Marcus's account uncorroborated and years old. But the judge allowed it, ruling that the evidence could be heard during the October 10th hearing to establish a pattern of behavior. The league board received an anonymous letter the next week. It was typed, "No return address." It said, "Coach Coleman made my son throw up twice last season. We did not report it because we were afraid. Now we see what happens to people who speak up. We are watching." Donald Hayes read the letter aloud at the next board meeting. No one spoke for a long time. Then a board member named Patricia Wells, a retired school teacher, said, "We have to do something. If we do not, this is going to explode." Hayes said, "It is already exploding. We need to wait for the hearing." But the hearing was still 9 days away. And in those 9 days, something else happened. A second former player came forward, then a third. Each one described a version of the same pattern: public humiliation, verbal abuse, physical intimidation. One of them, a 17-year-old senior who still played for a different travel team, said Coach Coleman once made him run laps until he vomited, then told the team to leave him there as a lesson. Arthur's dining room table became a command center. Sandra sent him reports every morning. Keisha called every afternoon with updates on who had contacted the station. By the day before the hearing, 6 former players had provided sworn statements. The night of October 9th, Arthur could not sleep. He sat in his recliner with the lights off, looking at the manila envelope that had started everything. He thought about Fallujah. He thought about the faces of the men he had carried off that roof. He thought about his grandson crying at the kitchen table. He thought about Coach Coleman's face when he saw the pin. That moment of recognition, the one that had made the coach go pale, was not just embarrassment, it was fear. It was the fear of a man who had just discovered that the person he had mocked was not defenseless, that the quiet man with the limp had a history, a record, and a lawyer. At 8:30 on the morning of October 10th, Arthur parked his Ford pickup in the lot outside the Greene County Courthouse. He wore a dark suit, a red tie, and the small golden navy pin on his lapel. Ethan held his hand. His daughter-in-law stood on his other side. Sandra met them at the entrance and said, "There are reporters, and there is a woman in the back row who says she has something that changes everything. She says she has it on video." The woman in the back row was named Diana Reeves. She was a mother of 2, one of whom played for the opposing team that day. She had been filming her son's game from the far sideline, 30 yards away, when the incident happened. She had not thought much of the footage at first, just another coach yelling, but after she saw the news segment, she went back and watched it again. She zoomed in. She turned up the audio. And she found something Arthur's side did not have. The full 30 seconds before the mockery, during which Coach Coleman had made an earlier remark about the old man taking up space on the bleachers. Sandra took the memory card to a tech vendor down the street. Within 2 hours, the footage was enhanced, time-stamped, and entered as Exhibit F. It showed Coleman walking toward the sideline, gesturing at Arthur and saying, "Some people think they can just sit here and take up room." Then the limp impression. Then the laugh. Then the exact moment Coleman's eyes dropped to the pin and his face went gray. Judge Tran viewed the footage in chambers. She emerged 20 minutes later and called both sides to the bench. She said, "This video changes the timeline. The defendant's motion to dismiss is denied. The restraining order remains in effect. We will proceed to a full evidentiary hearing in 30 days." Word spread within hours. The local affiliate ran the video with audio blurred faces of minors, but clear enough that everyone in Springfield knew exactly what had happened. By the next morning, the story had been picked up by a national cable news network. The segment ran during prime time. The anchor introduced it by saying, "A grandfather, a coach, and a pin that changed everything." The internet reacted the way the internet does. Arthur's face appeared on screens across the country. Some called him a hero, some called him a troublemaker. One comment thread, 47,000 posts deep, debated whether he was exploiting his service for attention. Another thread, started by a retired Marine, read, "He earned that pin. He earned the right to be seen. Do not confuse quiet dignity with weakness." Coach Coleman's attorney, Richard Voss, held a press conference on the courthouse steps. He stood behind a podium and read a prepared statement. "My client has apologized privately to Mr. Jenkins. This is a misunderstanding that has been weaponized by people who do not understand the pressures of competitive youth coaching. Coach Coleman has dedicated 16 years to building character in young athletes. One moment of poor judgment does not erase a lifetime of service to this community." A reporter asked if Coach Coleman would resign. Voss did not answer. He turned and walked back inside. That same evening, a GoFundMe appeared. It was titled "Stand with Coach Coleman." The goal was $50,000, intended for legal defense. Within 6 hours, it had raised $12,000. A counterpage appeared the next morning. "Support Arthur Jenkins, veteran." Its goal was $100,000. By midnight, it had raised $87,000. Arthur did not start the campaign. He did not know who started it. Sandra told him about it during a phone call at 10 p.m. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I did not ask for this. I just wanted an apology and a suspension." Sandra said, "You are not controlling this anymore. It has become bigger than you." She was right. The story was no longer about one coach and one grandfather. It was about every parent who had ever stayed silent, every veteran who had ever been disrespected, every child who had been humiliated in the name of discipline. 2 days later, a second video surfaced. This one was older, from 3 years prior, filmed by a parent at a tournament in Columbus. It showed Coach Coleman shoving a 14-year-old player by the shoulder pads after a loss. The player stumbled, caught himself, and walked off the field without looking back. The parent who filmed it had never shared it publicly because she was afraid of retaliation. Now she sent it to Keisha Thomas with a note that said, "I am sorry I waited so long." The Columbus video went viral in its own right. National sports commentators began discussing coaching culture. One former Olympic coach wrote an op-ed titled, "Winning is not an excuse for abuse." Another former player, now a professional athlete, tweeted, "I had a coach like Coleman. He broke something in me that never completely healed." The league board met again. This time, the meeting was not private. A reporter from the Springfield Gazette attended under public records access. Donald Hayes sat at the head of the table, flanked by 6 members. The 7th, Patricia Wells, had resigned the night before, citing irreconcilable differences with the board's failure to act. The meeting lasted 3 hours. At the end, the board voted to suspend Coach Coleman indefinitely, pending the outcome of the court case. The vote was 4-2. Hayes was one of the 2 dissenters. In his closing remarks, he said, "We are setting a precedent here. Every coach in this league will now be afraid to correct a player. That is not good for the sport." The next morning, a third former player came forward. This one was a young woman, now 21, who had played for Coleman when she was 11. She said he had called her a waste of a roster spot in front of her entire team. She said she quit soccer that season and never played again. She provided a diary entry from the night of the incident, written in a 12-year-old's handwriting. "Coach C said I should not be on the team. I think he is right." Arthur read that diary entry in his living room. Ethan sat beside him. Arthur closed the page and said, "Ethan, I need you to understand something. That coach did not just hurt me, he hurt a lot of people, and they are only now finding the courage to speak." Ethan was quiet. Then he said, "Grandpa, some kids at school are saying mean things about you. They said you are doing this for money." Arthur put a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Let them say it. I know the truth, and now the world knows it too." That week, a package arrived at Arthur's house. There was no return address. Inside was a bronze challenge coin from a unit Arthur had served with in Fallujah. Attached was a handwritten note. "Saw you on TV. You carried my brother off that roof. I never forgot. I never will. If you need anything, call this number." There was a name, Marcus T., the same name as the goalie who had come forward first. Arthur called the number. The man who answered said, "You do not know me personally, but you saved my older brother's life. He told me about that night. He said you would not leave until everyone was out. That limp of yours is not a weakness. It is a receipt." The next week, Coach Coleman's legal team made a final offer, a confidential settlement, no admission of guilt, and a mutual non-disclosure agreement. The offer included a payment of $200,000. Sandra presented it to Arthur in her office. She said, "This is a lot of money. It would cover your legal fees and leave you with a good amount, but you would have to sign away your right to ever speak about what happened." Arthur looked at the offer. He looked at the challenge coin on the table. He looked at the photo of Carol on his phone. He said, "What about the other families, the ones who filed affidavits, the kids who were hurt before Ethan?" Sandra said, "They are not part of this settlement. They would have to pursue their own cases." Arthur pushed the paper back across the desk. "Then I am not signing." Sandra nodded. She had expected this. She said, "Then we go to trial, and it will be public, and it will be ugly." Arthur said, "I have been through ugly before. I know how to walk through fire." The trial date was set for January 15th. The venue was moved to the County Superior Court to accommodate the expected crowd. Judge Tran would preside. The proceeding was expected to last 5 days. The week before the trial, a 4th former player came forward. This one was the most damaging yet. He was a 22-year-old college senior named James. He said that when he was 14, Coach Coleman had grabbed him by the throat during a practice. "Not hard enough to leave a mark," James said, "but hard enough to make him understand the power imbalance." James had never told anyone until he saw Arthur's story. He said, "That man never hit me, but he made me feel like he could. Every single day." The affidavit was filed. The The press printed excerpts. Coach Coleman's attorney requested a gag order, arguing that pretrial publicity would prejudice the jury. Judge Tran denied the motion. She said, "The defendant's own actions generated this publicity. He cannot now claim it is unfair." On January 14th, the night before the trial, Arthur sat alone in his living room. The house was quiet. The oak tree in the backyard was bare, etched against a cold winter sky. He opened the manila envelope one more time. He read the commendation. He touched the Purple Heart. He thought about Fallujah, about the heat, the dust, the sound of rotors. He thought about his wife Carol, who had seen him off to war and welcomed him home. He thought about Ethan, who had cried at the kitchen table. He closed the envelope and placed it on the table. Tomorrow, the world would hear his full story, not because he wanted fame, not because he wanted money, but because a 12-year-old boy needed to know that standing up for what is right is never the wrong move, even when the whole world is watching. The trial began at 9. The courtroom was packed. Ethan sat in the front row next to his mother. Arthur sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing the same dark suit, the same red tie, and the same small gold and navy pin. Coach Coleman sat across the aisle, wearing a gray suit, his face unreadable. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Tran entered. The jury was seated. Sandra stood to deliver her opening statement. She walked to the center of the room, looked at the jury, and said, "This case is not about one joke. It is not about one coach. It is about a system that told a decorated combat veteran that his dignity was less important than a winning record. And it is about the courage it takes to say no more." Sandra's opening statement lasted 12 minutes. She walked the jury through the timeline, the practice field, the mockery, the pin, the failed apology, the league's inaction, the 6 former players who had come forward. She did not raise her voice. She let the facts land like stones dropped into still water. Richard Voss delivered his opening next. He argued that Coach Coleman was a passionate educator who had made a single mistake, apologized immediately, and been unfairly transformed into a public villain. He said, "My client has coached hundreds of children over 16 years. He has been to their birthday parties. He has written college recommendations. One unguarded moment does not erase a life of service to youth." The first witness was Arthur. He walked to the stand with his limp visible under the fluorescent lights. He was sworn in. Sandra asked him to describe his military service. He spoke quietly, precisely, about 2 tours in Iraq, about the firebase outside Fallujah, about the shrapnel that had torn through his leg. He described the medal he never talked about and the pin he wore because it reminded him of the men who did not come home. Sandra asked, "When Coach Coleman imitated your limp, what did you feel?" Arthur paused. "I felt like I was back in a place I spent 20 years trying to leave." The jury did not look away from him. Then Sandra played the video. The courtroom watched in silence as Coleman pointed, limped, laughed. They watched his face change when he saw the pin. The video was 32 seconds long. It felt like an hour. Marcus, the former goalie, testified next. He was 20 now, tall and composed. He described the practice where Coleman grabbed him by the jersey and lifted him off the ground. He said, "I was 13. I weighed maybe 120 pounds. He was 6'2" and 250. I thought he was going to hit me. I wet my pants. He dropped me and told me to clean up and get back in goal." Marcus paused. "I never told my parents. I was ashamed." The courtroom was silent. Ethan, in the front row, was crying silently. James, the 4th former player, took the stand. He described the throat grab. He said he had never spoken about it until he saw Arthur's story. He said, "I am in therapy now. I have been for 3 years. That moment with Coach Coleman is one of the reasons I do not trust adult men in positions of authority." Coach Coleman's attorney cross-examined each witness, but the testimony was consistent, precise, corroborated by dates and diary entries, and in Marcus's case, a text message he had sent a friend the night of the incident. "Coach C lost it today. I am scared." On the 3rd day, Sandra called Diana Reeves, the mother who had filmed the full video. She described watching the incident from the far sideline, her decision to hold onto the footage, her guilt at not coming forward sooner. She said, "I kept thinking someone else will handle it, someone older, someone with more power, but no one did. It took a veteran to do what a league board should have done years ago." The defense rested without calling Coach Coleman to the stand. Richard Voss later told reporters that the decision was strategic. A combative cross-examination would have done more harm than good. On the fourth day, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. The courtroom was tense. Arthur sat in the hallway with Ethan, who had been excused from school. Ethan asked, "Grandpa, what happens if they do not believe us?" Arthur said, "Then we have learned something about the world, but we have also taught it something about us." At 5:42 in the afternoon, the jury returned. The foreman stood. Judge Tran asked for the verdict. On the first count, violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, liable. On the second count, intentional infliction of emotional distress, liable. On the third count, violation of the league's own code of conduct, pursued as a breach of contract claim, liable. The damages were awarded: $400,000 in compensatory damages, $50,000 in punitive damages. Coach Coleman's face was expressionless. His attorney requested the jury be polled. Each member confirmed the verdict. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Arthur walked out with Ethan on one side and Sandra on the other. He stopped at the podium. He said, "I did not come here for money. I came here because a 12-year-old boy asked me if it was okay to be afraid, and I needed to show him that fear is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of courage." Coach Coleman did not speak to reporters. He left through a side door. The league board announced that evening that his coaching credentials had been permanently revoked. Donald Hayes resigned as president the following day. But the story changed quietly a few weeks later. A reporter from the Gazette discovered that Coach Coleman had his own history. His father, a Vietnam veteran, had died by suicide when Coleman was 16. The reporter found a letter Coleman had written to his high school counselor, never sent, that read, "My father came home from war and never found peace. I do not want to be him." When Arthur learned this, he sat in his kitchen for a long time. He thought about the men he had served with, the ones who made it home and the ones who did not. He thought about the cycles of pain that pass from one generation to the next. He thought about the coach who had mocked his limp and the wounded boy who had become that coach. Sandra called a week later and offered to arrange a conversation between Arthur and Coach Coleman, mediated by a trauma counselor. Arthur considered it. Then he said, "Not yet, maybe not ever, but I will not hate him. I do not have the space for that." The league rewrote its code of conduct. It added mandatory training on disability awareness, veteran sensitivity, and emotional abuse prevention. The new policy required all coaches to sign an acknowledgement that public humiliation would result in immediate suspension and a mandatory board review within 72 hours. Patricia Wells, the board member who had resigned in protest, was re-elected and became the new league president. Arthur received hundreds of letters, some from veterans who thanked him for speaking up, some from parents who apologized for staying silent. One letter was from a 9-year-old girl who wrote, "I am missing my leg. Kids make fun of me at recess. Your story made me feel less alone." Arthur framed that letter and hung it in his garage. Ethan returned to soccer the following spring, not for the Springfield Strikers, which had dissolved after the scandal, but for a new team in a neighboring county. The coach was a young man who had played professionally for 2 seasons before an injury ended his career. At the first practice, Ethan's new coach knelt down and said, "I heard about your grandfather. I am honored to coach you." Arthur drove him to every practice. He sat in a folding chair on the sideline. He wore his gold and navy pin. He did not hide his limp. And the children on the team learned to call him Mr. Jenkins and later just Grandpa. The oak tree in his backyard grew another 3 inches that year. Arthur Jenkins did not set out to change a system. He set out to defend the quiet dignity of a life he had earned. But that is how real change happens, not through committees or press releases, but through one person who refuses to let disrespect stand. The question his story leaves behind is not about one coach or one league. It is about the thousands of youth sports fields where children are still being humiliated in the name of discipline. It is about the veterans who still hide their service pins because they do not want to invite attention. It is about the parents who witness something wrong and convince themselves it is not their place to speak. Arthur received an invitation 6 months after the trial. A national youth sports organization asked him to speak at their annual conference. The theme was rebuilding trust. He stood at a podium in a hotel ballroom in front of 800 coaches and administrators. He wore the same suit, the same tie, the same gold and navy pin. He said, "You have the power to decide what kind of environment your children grow up in. It does not require a lawsuit. It requires the courage to say, that is not how we treat people." The room gave him a standing ovation. Some of the coaches in the audience were crying. Arthur does not consider himself a public figure. He still lives in the same house in Greenfield, Ohio. He still drinks coffee on Sunday mornings in Carol's rocking chair. He still picks up Ethan from soccer practice. But on his dining room table, there is a new frame now. It holds a letter from a 9-year-old girl who lost her leg and said his story made her feel less alone. He reads it sometimes when he needs to remember why he did it. There is a group chat that still lights up his phone every few weeks. 6 former players who came forward, Marcus, James, 3 others, and a mother who finally found the courage to share her video. They send updates, milestones, photos of their own kids playing sports. They do not call themselves survivors. They call themselves the people who were finally believed. The foundation holds because you maintain it. Arthur Jenkins learned that building bridges, and he learned it defending his own dignity. His limp is still there. So is the pin. And the next time a coach thinks twice before mocking a player or a parent, a grandfather somewhere just might be the reason. If this story moved you, share it. Because the people who need to hear it are the ones who are still wondering if speaking up is worth it. Subscribe to see more stories about courage that does not make headlines but changes lives anyway. The oak tree is still growing.